everyone. My name is Kelsey Manglallan, and I am a current social work student in the master's program. Today, I'll be going over my systematic literature review, which is what I did for my capstone, and it was on electronic nicotine use among Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander adolescents, young adults, and military within in the US and USAPI. So a little bit of a background is studies have indicated that AANHPI adolescents, young adults, and active duty service members significantly have higher ENDS rates. ENDS products are electronic nicotine delivery systems. So it's a broad term that encompasses all types of e-cigarettes, cigalikes, vape pens, kind of anything you want to call it that is electronic and delivering nicotine, I identified as ENDS. So the CDC reported 30.6% of middle school youth in Hawaii have ever used ENDS products, and of these youth, 45.5% of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander ancestry and 24.2% are of Asian American ancestry, so pretty big number. A study that was conducted in the 25th Infantry Division located on an island at Schofield Barracks found 65% of study participants ages 18 to 24 reported ever using ENDS products, and that's trying it, using it the past 30 days, or currently using, compared to the 38% who were over 35 that tried ENDS products. So the purpose was to systematically review the recently published scientific literature related to ENDS use within AANHPI adolescents, young adults, and active duty service members. So initially the study, my systematic review was on young adults or adolescents and young adults within AANHPI. And because of the findings and the high usage rates, I really wanted to explore a little bit further and dive into active duty service members and but AANHPI populations within active duty. So because they had higher rates in their youth and young adults, what does that look like when they join the military? Because the military already has higher use found already because of the military culture. So the biggest differences in my inclusion criteria for the first search was ages 12 to 29 with a mean population of under 29. And the population had to at least be 50% Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander. For the active duty search, it was ages 17 to 34, and that's because you cannot join the military until you're 17. And 34 because the military defines their age groups a little bit differently, and 34 and below is kind of considered young adults across the studies, but again, I kept the mean at 29 or below. And the studies had to identify are exclusively or separately for ENDS products use. So they could not use, like if they examined correlates to ENDS use, it couldn't be like ENDS use and cigarettes or ENDS use and marijuana use, or it had to exclusively view nicotine ENDS products separately. So from the review, 11 articles were included that just focused on AANHPI populations. But for the secondary review for active duty, 0 studies were actually included because 0 studies actually looked at AANHPI populations. Of the studies that were pulled, there was only like a few, maybe I think it was 2 that even looked at ethnicity or race in the demographics, and they were white, Black, Hispanic, or non-Hispanic. So it didn't even include Asian American, it didn't include Pacific Islander, and it definitely didn't include Native Hawaiian, which was kind of disappointing. So from the results, they did indicate that AANHPI adolescents and young adults that were not in the military, there were interpersonal and individual correlates that influence their use. So exposure through peers and family relationships, that could be peer pressure, that could be just teaching your friend about it or saying, you know, hey, try this, or same with your uncle or auntie. Stimulation or sensation seeking, so flavors or habits, like nicotine use, trying to go away from combustible cigarettes, or the flavors that were targeting these populations, like taro, lychee, pog, which is passion orange guava, lychee, all those type of flavors were targeting these populations. They were socially viewed more positively. So our generation, or my generation, which is the younger generation, kind of identifies cigarettes as gross, or they smell or whatever. So they were viewed more positively because of the lack of smell and all that, and lack of perceived harm. The military, I did include this because it looked at all across the military, and within all the military, the studies found that the correlates to use was a lack of perceived ends harm. It was viewed as a cessation aid, so they were trying to quit smoking or taper off of smoking combustible cigarettes, or accessibility, so location limitations, because a lot of policies already exclude combustible cigarettes from being smoked in certain areas, and they are changing to include e-cigarettes, but again, e-cigarettes are a lot more discreet because of the lack of smell, and some don't even have smoke visible, so it's a more accessible for people who want to smoke. And then military related factors was the biggest difference, because of deployment history, so how many times they were deployed, where they were deployed, and the units they were deployed with. So were they on the front lines? Were they back? What did they experience? So for my discussion, ends products can be seen as a entry use to dual usage. So low risk adolescents could be considered at increased risk. There's a huge gap in US military ends use research, especially within AANHPI populations. So that definitely should be addressed in future research. And then there's also a gap in culturally relevant evidence-based prevention interventions for AANHPI adolescent populations. As you can see, there was only one study that focused on this population, and it was a culturally grounded prevention. And then to conclude, here is the 11 studies that were included. I did do a nice little graph so you can see the correlates, description. I broke down race and ethnicity to include like if they identified OAAPI, which is other Asian American Pacific Islander. So again, I made sure to include which type of Asian American or Pacific Islander was identified in the study. Thank you for listening.